Alright, what's happening everyone? Shane, aka Wild Poker here, and after a long hiatus from YouTube videos and review videos, we're back. I'm doing a MTT final table review that was submitted to me, and we're going to take time, we're going to break down a lot of situations, and what I hope to do through this is actually show you guys how you should be studying every single final table you make when you're playing MTTs. Reason being is, final tables are very hard to make, and that's where all the money is. So when you get there, you want to make sure that you're making the best decision you can every single time. And the only way to do that is really in-depth review of every single one of your final tables. And you're not only just reviewing the spots that you think are close, but you're reviewing spots that you weren't even involved in, making sure you're checking your opponents, trying to find out where they're making mistakes and take good notes on them. Or they're making a play that you wouldn't have made but actually turns out to be correct, so it's something you could learn from that. You want to look at a lot of the spots around the table, really in depth, really break it down, and try to get as much information out of that final table as you can during your review session. And although in this video I'm not going to do every single spot because it would just take me way too long and it would make the YouTube video way too long, I'm going to give you guys some good examples of how to do it, and then you can decide how much work you want to actually put in. The more work you put in, the more you're going to get out of it, the better you're going to get in the long term. So I recommend really taking the time and doing it. So as an MTT player, you guys should all already know this, but a mandatory program is some sort of Icm Calculator, some sort of range calculator. I use Hold'em Resources Calculator. Another one that's out there is Icmizer. Definitely mandatory as an MTT player to have those. They're going to pay for themselves multiple times over with the amount of value that you can get from learning from them. So if you're cautious about investing the $100 or whatever it costs a year for these programs, trust me, it's worth it. Very worth it. Even if you guys are playing micro stakes, it's going to pay for itself. Just wanted to point that out. We'll be spending a lot of time in this program here in just a few seconds. The other thing that you want to use, or what I recommend doing, is getting some sort of range calculator. And I'll show you why we're going to use this. One of the simple ways that we use this here in just a second. Hold'em EQ here comes from Flopzilla. You get it free when you buy Flopzilla. There's a bunch of free range equity calculators you can get online and some paid ones that do some other extra cool stuff. So if you just want to do a Google search of poker equity calculator, you can see all the different ones that'll pop up. But this one comes with Flopzilla if you guys are interested in the one that I'm using. The one thing that I want to say is, I wanted to show real quick is how I calculated the payouts because I actually didn't get them. So an important thing when you get into starting to study these final tables is actually, if you know you're going to study a tournament, let's say you're making a deep run and you know you're probably going to put in some time studying it, definitely take a screenshot of the payouts, give it a good name so you can find it later, and use that to be very accurate. What I did know about this tournament, that there was $2,400 up top, and I just used this category here from ACR's website in order to get an estimate of the payouts. I'm not sure if these are right or not, but at least we have something pretty close to work with. And since I knew the final prize, I was able to calculate all these. So we just put it in from 10th all the way up because everyone's already in the money here. And what that looks like is this here. So everyone's already locked up 154 and now they're playing for that $40 jump right there. So definitely some ICM involved at the final table that we're going to be looking at. For the first hand here, let's just start digging right into it, and we'll see how we can kind of explore some of these spots and really get the maximum study value out of each and every single hand. So here, I think what a lot of people would do is look at the 6-9, say clear fold, move on, and not even look at this hand. But one thing that's interesting here is we have almost a 5 big blind shove, and we have a call here, and we see King 7 and 9-8 show up. So one thing I think that would be really good to do is spend some time thinking about, is King 7 a shove here? When you get 5 big blinds, what is your shoving range? You could spend a little bit of time looking into that. One thing I think that people would do that's a mistake is probably think that they should be shoving any 2 in this spot. And my guess is most people's shoving ranges are going to end up being pretty wide. And at the same time, is 9-8 a call here? If people are shoving any 2, maybe it is. But I think if people are shoving appropriate ranges, it might actually fall into a fold. So we're going to look at that. And this is where this comes in and really forces you to check your assumptions and hold yourself accountable to your assumptions rather than just saying kind of half-assed, King 7's close and then checking it and it turns out king seven's a shove, and you really don't really spend any time thinking about the range. You're going to force yourself to check your range assumptions. And I'm not going to do this with every hand. I'm just going to show this as an example, and then we won't do it for the rest. But if you guys want to do it for each and every single hand I do in this video, I think it'll be very good practice for you and something I strongly recommend if you want to get the most out of this study session. Also, one thing I was going to say is you can do the same thing for your hand range as well. If you're not 100% positive about what your shoving range here should be, then you want to do this as well. So what you do here, and actually I'm going to use our range as the example, is put in exactly what you would shove if you were this player here. I'm going to put in something like this. I think our range is actually going to be somewhat tight, even though we're pretty short. I might be a little tight here, might be a little loose. We're going to find out. This is just us going to be checking this. So what you can do is you can either leave this aside or you can take a screenshot and hold it up. But because you've held yourself accountable and actually written it down or made an image that shows it, it's going to really stick in your mind just that much more when you're comparing it to the range that the calculator outputs. You're actually going to visually see the differences and find places where you're either too tight or too loose. And doing that comparison is way more valuable to you than just kind of thinking in your head about a range that it's really hard to visualize to begin with, and then comparing it to a range that it shows. You're just not going to get that real value out of it. And I would do something like this for us, this player, and then check all of those. So let's put that aside for just a second, and we'll go here. Okay, so the first thing that we can see is ICM is actually a very, very big factor for us here in the cutoff, with a 5 big blind stack lift to act, and then the other 2 stacks covering us, as you can see here. And so because of that, we're supposed to be very, very tight, only opening, jamming 28%. And you can see we can put these right up side by side. I'm at 36%, so that I know if this was the range that I actually thought we were shoving, I know that I'm way too wide and I'm definitely just leaking money all over the place. So I would just go in and start tightening that up. All these ones that are really borderline, we're actually going to be folding those as well. And I like to go to about 0.1. Depending on the strength of the table, the worse players are playing, it actually is good for you to tighten up a little bit and let them make the mistakes for you and just get those free, ladder ups that you wouldn't be able to get if you got knocked out of the tournament earlier by making a very thin shove. So as players are playing worse and worse, it actually benefits you a little bit to tighten up just slightly from what these calculators are showing. If they're all playing very, very good, you want to get as close to 0 as you can. But another thing with these is these aren't perfect simulations, meaning that in order to actually have the best perfect numbers, we would actually have to run, a million simulations or a very high number of simulations in order to get exact numbers. So for example, this is slightly profitable this time, but if I ran it again, it might be negative the next time because it's not perfect. So you want to give yourself a little bit of leeway as well in that aspect, and I would just stay away from all these ones that are borderline, even against the strongest competition. But that being said, let's go ahead and tighten ourselves up here. So yeah, so now we know, we're getting a much tighter range. Actually, even this is what our range should look like. And we could see that from that range before, I was just going way too wide, making a huge mistake, just punting off money with a massive chunk of my range. And actually here, we can see that we're even playing quite a bit tighter than this because we're chopping off some of these very, very low equity plays. And you can just do that for every single player that you really want to dig into. Anytime you think you're not sure about what your ranges look like, I would recommend doing that and just keep doing that process, taking pictures, recording it so that you can come back and review it later very quickly, because you could have a saved image of what I thought, what it recommends, and what I think I should actually do by adjusting down some of these. You have all those images, and you could just take some notes, 10 big blind stack in the cutoff, low ICM, 1 short stack after, 2 stacks covered, however you want to record that, but take those notes so you can just quickly review that, and you can do those reviews and review those images, spend 10 minutes before you start your session that day, or on the breaks during your actual final table play, or when you're late in a tournament, on your breaks, spend a couple minutes just kind of reviewing those. Anything you can do to just keep those things fresh in your mind when you're out playing your session is going to be very good. So that's as in-depth as we're going to use that range calculator. I'm not going to break into that again, but like I said, if you guys really want to take the time and make the most out of this video, do that every single time. So the next one that I think is going to be really surprising to you guys is the short stack button here. I went away from the screen just for a second, so hopefully you guys can actually spend the time putting in your range yourself. And if you want to do that, I would pause and put in your ranges for this player and this player, because we're going to be going on right now. So this player here is actually only shoving 41% of hands, and you can see again there's a lot of these really cuspy hands that could probably be tightened up. I think this is a lot tighter at 5 big blinds than most of you guys would be playing, and definitely a lot tighter than I would have been playing, to be honest, as well. So again, we could see that there's probably some room for improvement for you guys. I guess if anyone out there is playing tighter than this, then there's still some room for improvement, because you could loosen up a little bit. But this is a good way to kind of check your super short stack game on the button. Make sure you're not getting too crazy. And then we see that from the big blinds perspective, I think a lot of players would see 5 big blinds and just kind of say, oh, we could probably call about any 2. But you can see that because he's playing this tight, we're actually only supposed to be calling with 63% of hands. And again, we see a lot of really close ones that we could actually move into folds and probably get us down somewhere closer to 50% of hands. And 9-8 off would actually be one of those very, very close calls that if I would see a player playing as tight as they should be, I might not need to make this one. However, the one consideration is, if you are a massive chip leader, calling and losing isn't going to affect your position in the tournament at all. Then you want to be playing as close as possible with your calling range as this indicates. You don't want to get wider, because then you're making negative EV plays and you're actually hurting your long-term results. But by playing as close to this as possible, you're not inducing any risk into your long-term results, and you're actually reducing your variance long-term, because you're making with your whole range, you're making the highest EV play. So there is that exception that when you have the chip leader and it's not going to affect your tournament position, you really want to play as close as this recommends. But this is still maybe a little bit tighter than a lot of you guys would have thought. So that's another thing that I pointed out. And then the last thing that I think is really important is if it's folded to the small blind, because of the way that the ICM works and this stack size, even though we're playing for almost 26 big blinds, if you're in the small blind here with this kind of a chip lead and you see these, short stacks around the table and you can apply that kind of ICM pressure, you're super pumped to just jam any 2 cards. All day, every day, let's go, let's get the money in. So that's another learning spot for maybe some people who, might have been a little bit iffy and might be a little bit tight in the spot and actually having a folding range. And you can see that these are actually really profitable. And the reason being is, once we jam here, this guy should be playing a pretty tight range. Obviously, if we're up against a player who's going to start incorrectly widening his range, we do have to tighten up. But realistically, players are going to be playing pretty tight at that stack size. So you get to go pretty crazy, which is kind of cool. Okay, so we see the King 7. We know that is in the shoving range, but our range here is probably tighter than we expected, and we know that the 9-8 is going to be a reasonable call. And if you did all the work, you learned a lot about all 3 ranges, and you might have learned a little bit about that. And that's just from one hand, and you can study all these positions and all these different stack sizes in this ICM situation. So let's keep moving on. So here's another spot where right away we could be taking notes on this guy. You're seeing this open sizing. This is very unorthodox. Good indicator of a recreational player. So I would be looking to take some notes. Everybody folds. Not going to put any work into studying that hand, other than knowing that we would have taken a note. Here, we're now seeing a 2 big blind open. So right away we know that there's actually some potential for some bet sizing tells on this player when they're having that almost 4 big blind open, and then the next hand they're going to a min. So very likely a recreational player, and we want to be trying to get the showdown and trying to make as good of notes as we can in order to take advantage of what leaks this player might have. Ace-8 here is definitely not a reshove, but this could be a spot where you might be wondering what your reshove range should be here. You know, you might want to be spending some time putting it in the calculator. This is one that we're not going to do because your reshove range here is actually going to be quite tight in this situation when you have another gun open and then you still have all these players left to act. You're going to be very, very tight here. But if you're concerned or wondering at all what it looks like, then I would definitely spend some time plugging that in. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time studying. Well, let's look at the hand and just see if anything develops. If we get to a showdown, you do want to see if hands get to showdown, because that will give you a study opportunity to either study the individual player, or if they played a hand a way that looked different than you, how you would play it. You want to study both how you would play it and how they played it, and see if both players are making mistakes, or they're playing something better than you, or they're making a mistake and you can take a note on it. So there's a lot of different ways you can study. You know, when you get to the showdown here, we don't get much. So this is a clear fold here, but I think this is a good opportunity. When it's folded to us, we do want to have a good idea of what our open shoving range should look like. So we're going to plug this into the calculator real quick and take a look. And while I'm doing that, guys, I would pull out your ranges and see what range you're putting in and compare it to the range that I'm about to pull up here in a second. And here comes the range. So if you need to pause the video, go ahead and do that. And you can see very, 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 very tight here. Basically, ace-10 suited. I mean, I would even be comfortable folding like these hands here. Really tight in this spot. This is probably quite a bit tighter than... To be honest, I'll tell you, my range would have definitely included hands like Jack-10 suited to Ace-10 suited and Ace-9 and Ace-8. And it would have included 7s and 6s. And that would have probably been the cutoff here. And I would have probably been down to Ace-Jack. So I would have been, you know, playing a range similar to what this is playing, but one that we can see that, you know, in an environment where people are making mistakes, we're very, very thin, and we might actually do better by just being a little bit tighter. So there's that hand. And let's keep moving on. And one thing we can do is we just saw our under the gun +1 range, right? I'll bring it back here, and how tight that was. And we have this one here for the under the gun range of a guy that's a little bit deeper stacked than us, but close. And we can kind of use that to come up with a good range for what we should be jamming under the gun. And we definitely know that Ace-3 isn't anywhere close to an under the gun shove. And again, if you're still not sure, if you're, you know, a little unclear, you can run this in again. But that's kind of a shortcut that we can use. Is we have a spot that's very similar here, right? Things haven't changed all that much, and we can know that, you know, we just tighten up just a little bit, and we're probably doing pretty good. And so our range would probably get somewhere down to this, you know, 6%, because we're going to be cutting out all of this stuff, you know, all this stuff down here that is at a 0 or break-even shove. So use the information you already have and try to make really good guesses so that you're not just... You want to try to be efficient with your time, right? You don't... If there's a way to do something that isn't costing you extra time, but you can still get a lot of information out of it, find that way to do it, if that makes sense. And I think using a little bit of a shortcut when we just studied a hand that was a very similar situation, and we have some information based on a player that's close-ish, we can put all that together and come up with a really good solution. All right, so here's a hand that we're definitely going to review. One thing we're going to look at is, at this stack size, should we have a min-raise range on the button? And then we're also going to look at, if this guy does have a min-raise range, what does our reshove range look like? And then also we're going to look at what does this player's reshove range look like in this situation. So we're going to look at this a couple different ways. All right, so the first thing I did, just to check whether we should have a min-raise range or not, is I gave us the option to either min-raise or to go all in. And you can see that in the min-raise, the computer program is only choosing to use 0.1% of its range, which basically means no. We don't ever want to do a min-raise if the players after us are going to be playing perfectly pre-flop in this situation. What it's choosing to do is jam 50% of its range, as you can see here. And that's a key indicator that we should be just push folding at this stack size here. Just under 15 big blinds. However, what I would say is if one, players are going to be playing too tight to your min raise by either folding too much or by not reshoving over you, then you actually generate quite a bit of EV with the min raise. So it's also important to know what their ranges should look like. And we can see here when we min raise, the small blind should be calling with 20% and then jamming another 20%. So they should be continuing a total of 40% of the time. And the big blind here should be calling 89% and folding or jamming almost 10%. So basically they should be continuing in some one way or the other with about 100% of the range. So one thing I think you'll know is that that's not the case. You're probably going to be getting, maybe 15 to 20% folds from the big blind player, and probably quite a bit more folds from the small blind as well, because they're probably putting themselves in a push fold situation rather than making these calls. So against players who aren't playing perfect, I would say that developing a min-range strategy you could see could be kind of nice, because you are actually generating fold equity where you shouldn't, and you could see how wide people should be. So this gives you kind of an indicator of what kind of stats you should be looking for when you're thinking about developing that min-raise range. If you're looking at two players that are really tight, really low 3-bet frequencies, high fold to steal frequencies, then I would actually recommend starting to implement a min-raise strategy and do a min-raise fold, and basically take all of these hands, put those in the min-raise, and also just widen it out quite a bit from this as well. Start adding in all the king X offsuits, all the king X suiteds, really get wide with your range and try to take advantage of that. And then you're probably going to end up it's hard for us because I didn't put it in here, but you're going to end up calling with a lot of a reasonable chunk of this range. But what you're taking advantage of with their tightness is you actually get to min-raise fold, some of these hands that are pretty borderline and some of these wider hands, because you know that when they 3-bet you, they're 3-betting a really tight, strong range, and they're actually folding way more than they should. So hopefully that makes sense. But what we showed here basically is against really strong players or really aggressive players, just play the jam all in pre-flop range. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to do was rerun that, but to where we're only playing a push fold range. And so here what I would do, the first thing actually I want to go back here. If he does min raise, what are we calling with if we're in the small blind? And you can see that 8-9 suited, is calling about half the time, which means it's probably going to be jamming the other half the time. Doing some slow playing with some of the stronger hands, because I think we're expecting some reshoves from the big blind once we call, or actually a pretty decent amount of shoves. Almost 10%. But if they're not playing too aggressive, we can see that we can actually call pretty darn wide here and should be calling pretty wide. And 3-betting wise, it's interesting that it's actually choosing to jam these even though it thinks it's negative EV. Interesting, but I would definitely stick to the range that's in green here. I definitely wouldn't go into the range that's red, even though that it's showing some of them in here. But we can see that's a pretty negative EV jam versus the min raise, but a pretty close plus EV call. So I would base this off of how tight or aggressive the big blind is. And then obviously the other thing we can check real quick if it's folded to us, we can see that we're vastly preferring to just jam ourselves. Very, very wide range. I wouldn't be messing around with the min open strategy unless we're against like the tightest player in the world. Okay, so now he's only shoving or folding. And you can see that when we get to the button range, if he's only shoving or folding, he's now at 51%. So basically just bump that up. And we're going to respond by playing very tight as expected. So one thing, hopefully you've plugged this in your ranges, you know, what you would be doing if he's shoving, what you would call with. And hopefully you've got something that looks pretty close to this. And then also for the big blind, hopefully you've done the same work. The big blind can definitely widen it up a little bit because it's getting a better price and it doesn't have to worry about an extra player maybe coming in behind. So there's what that looks like. And then also, hopefully you've done some time thinking about what your shove range would look like in this spot if it was folded to you. And you can see you're jamming a very, very wide range here. And the 9-8 specifically is well within a plus EV range. And then going even further, what the big blind calling range should be if you do jam in a small blind. And that would look like that. And so again, you can see one hand, there was so many different things that we could look into and talk about without one hand. And, you know, if you spent the time taking good notes and taking all the images and storing them, you have those ready to go to review for later. And it also means that you don't have to put in the time doing all this analysis the next time if you have that stored and ready to go. Okay, so we went through that hand. Obviously a jam with the jacks, and we see this guy call here. So we're going to look at what our range should be shoving here, and then what his calling range should be here for this hand. Hopefully you guys are making your ranges right now. Alright, so it gets to us, and we can see that we're still playing somewhat tight on the button at 10 big blinds, only able to jam 35%. So one thing that's interesting is we're at 10 big blinds here, right? 9.7. And we're not that much tighter than a 5 big blind range that we saw earlier. That I think was at something like 43%. Maybe it's actually here. 41%. Right, that's not a huge difference. So that's kind of interesting where you would think that with that much extra stack and also being here, or actually at this point, before a few hands ago we were actually pretty similar stack size to a lot of people. Now we've dropped down to the shortest stack. So that might be one reason that our range actually gets to be almost as wide as the 5 big blind stack earlier. But yeah, not tightening up maybe as much as I thought we would versus that really, really short stack. And so that's what our jamming range should look like. And hopefully you guys have built the range for him calling as well. And we can see that his calling range should actually be pretty tight because, again, we should only be shoving a pretty tight range. And let's see what he showed up with here. Jack 9. So Jack 9, and here's another thing that we can do to study. First thing we see is Jack 9 is clearly negative EV. And if we see something that's negative EV like that, the first thing we want to do, here's our range. Let's take a quick screenshot just to compare here in a second. So here's what our shoving range should look like, but let's say we get to him And if we know he's calling with Jack 9, he's probably going to be calling too wide. So let's see what happens when we widen up his range a little bit here. Rerun it. And now we go to us and we see that we've tightened up to 30.6%. So the one thing we have to be aware of is if people aren't going to be playing ICM ranges, it's actually needs to affect how our strategy plays against them. So you can see here was our range before, and you can compare how much tighter we're getting now. You can actually see that, I would probably even consider folding the pocket twos, folding some of this stuff in here as well, where before we were getting out to here, folding some of these down here. Definitely wanting to tighten up a little bit when their range is getting that much wider and out of whack. So what I would do here is make a note on this guy, calls too wide when chip leader, big blind versus 10 big blind, button shove, or something like that. Whatever you need to know that you're going to actually have to tighten up your ICM ranges just a little bit because this guy's playing incorrectly. And obviously with our jacks, we're, I think this is another hand where people would probably shove and not spend another second really thinking about this hand ever again because this was standard from their perspective. But now we've got a good note on this guy that can help us down the road if we ever see him at a final table or even before a final table when we're in a short stack position and he's in the big blind. We've got these extra notes on him and they're going to help us down the road. And that's just going to give you an extra edge over the people that aren't putting in that time doing that study. All right, next hand we can move on from that one. All right, so one thing we've already learned is that this shouldn't happen. Maybe another spot for us to have a, well, yeah, let's just stick to that. There are reasons to limp, similar to how the calculator showed us that we shouldn't ever really be min raising the button. We knew that if the blinds are actually playing quite a bit tighter than what the calculator's showing, we could probably adjust to have a min raise fold strategy and take advantage of their extra tightness. Similarly, there are situations where you can take advantage of players by limping and having a limp shove strategy, and also limping and when they, let's say this player is going to play really straightforward versus limp and just automatically raise all of his strong hands but check back all of his weak. Now you could limp your whole range. When he checks back, you can just bet every single flop because you know that his range is capped and you can take advantage of it that way. So against really straightforward players, you do have some arguments for limping and just letting them give you that extra information pre-flop. But we already saw earlier that he can apply a ton of ICM pressure by just jamming on him, right, and getting those folds right away because of all the other short stacks and this guy being at a decent mid stack on the table. So we already know that we have a profitable shove with any two cards here. And looks like he was going for the limp raise. And I think a lot of players would consider this standard. If you are going to limp, this would go into the limp shove. However, if we shove the fives here, he's actually supposed to fold king jack. So let's plug this in the calculator. And now what I'm going to do is actually mess around with some assumptions and see if maybe we can't get some information out of this, and maybe if I can't prove what I was saying to you guys a little bit more. Okay, so the first thing to show here is if we give it the option of limping or shoving, you can see what it prefers by quite a bit. Just shoving 100% of the range, a lot of profitability kicking in here. But again, one of the things that happen is when we shove, we're expecting that the player plays really tight. So the first thing I want to do is we saw the guy get in with king jack, so we're going to widen his range up a little bit. Okay, so the first thing that we're seeing happen is once he starts calling wider than he's supposed to, we actually start seeing some incentive for limping. Because now there's a bunch of hands that play more profitably by just trying to get to see the flop when this guy is checking back. So the first thing that we've seen is as he's playing wider, and we didn't even widen it out all that much. One, we want to not be shoving any two. We want to actually start getting into a limping strategy and shoving more, limping with our really strong hands, but still shoving. I mean, ace king is obviously really strong. Still shoving a decent amount. Basically, the way this works is this hand does better by just picking up the folds pre-flop and has enough equity that when called to make up for the times that it's called. The fold equity makes up for the fact that it's going to be in bad shape when called, but it still has enough equity that everything works out to where it's more plus EV to shove than the limp, it seems. The hands that are mixed means that I guess the EV is considered pretty close. All right, so we've already shown that once they start widening up a little bit, that we actually can develop a limping strategy, and shoving the any two isn't ideal. So we would have to, one thing I would do is make a note on this guy that him getting it in here with a king jack is showing that he's probably going to getting it in wider in these ICM spots than he actually should. So we need to make that note that he's just a slight bit wider than what he should be in these 20 big blind situations when he's risking his tournament life. And that's note number one. Okay, so now the next thing we're going to do is see that kind of what I was saying, when players are playing really straightforward, these are all the hands that are checking. Let's do something like this. So he's raising a really strong range and then just checking back a bunch of stuff, but he's actually probably, I mean, he's going to have a couple decent hands in his range here, but not the best. So he's still somewhat capped. So we've set that. And now look, now we're limping almost 70% of our range based on the fact that two things are happening. One, when we jam, he's calling a little bit too wide, but when we limp, he's playing pretty straightforward. And we have to consider that this is a situation where we're limping and this guy's only shoving. If it's a situation where he's making it 3x, it's going to be even better for us because now there's some weak hands in our range that have to fold to this shove, but can actually limp call the 3 big blind range. And there's some hands that can't really profitably call, but because they can develop some fold equity, can profitably reshove and actually pick up an even bigger pot than just open shoving by themselves, if he's actually going to have a 3x range versus just shoving. So the limp becomes even better in that case when we face a 3x. But basically what I wanted to show here, I'm not trying to come up with the exact perfect ranges because, in order to do that, we need to really have good estimations for the strategy that the opponent's playing. But you can see pretty quickly that limping starts to become a really effective strategy at the 20 big blind stacks. Even when there's some ICM involved, and when we jam, they should be folding pretty tight. And I kind of already showed a lot of those examples. They're playing straightforward or fairly straightforward versus our limp. And if we do jam, they're going to be calling a little bit too wide against us. That's going to force us to actually want to just start limping a ton. And you can kind of see how that limp range is looking here. And the one thing that you can see is when you do start limping, you get to start playing every single hand. That's another thing as well. We're still playing every single hand, I guess. Our other option was to jam 100%. So that's kind of an interesting exploration of the strategy here. So I wouldn't note too much about the limp jam here. If this guy's going to be raising any wide of a range, pocket fives is probably okay to get it in. And I don't know enough about these guys to really say what they're doing. But one thing I think we do know is that his range in this ICM spot is probably a little bit wider than what it should be. So that's a note as well. So again, another hand where we didn't play, could have easily been skipped over. We got a note on another player and spent some time actually thinking about why we want to develop a limping strategy versus just jamming the 20 big blinds effective here. A lot of studying happening, people. And now we've got a 2.81 size. So this guy's all over the place. Hopefully we've got some good notes on this guy. We want to see showdowns to kind of try to identify, but we've definitely at this point in the tournament tagged him as a recreational player and made a note that we want to keep an eye out on some various bet sizings that he's using. Okay, 2.81 again. All right, let's look at this one. To me, sixes is actually really close here. But we've seen earlier, we're supposed to be playing pretty tight in these spots. We've actually got some more chips now and definitely have some decent ICM pressure on us in this situation. So I think the sixes is actually going to end up being a good fold, but I think this is one that's really close. And also one where I definitely would assume that there's a lot of people out here that would be okay just jamming the sixes for the 16 big blinds. So let's plug it in. And hopefully you guys are putting together what your range looks like in this spot so you can compare it to what I'm about to put out. So we end up folding. Let's see if there's any other action that we can check. Okay, and so also, if you wanted to, you could, although we don't get to see the showdown, you could check this guy's range as well. And 10 big blinds. And, compare that as well, even though we don't get to see it. It's still a good check for you. So I'm about to bring it over, so if you need to give it a pause, go ahead and do that. But here we come. And man, we can see at 16 big blinds if we are only open shoving or folding. Looks like it's 10s plus for me is where I would be at. And like ace jack, king queen suited. Very tight range here. And one thing you got to be careful of is if you're looking at a push fold chart only, it's going to tell you that your range actually goes down to here. And, it's going to tell you probably all of these things in your range. Or let's look at it this way. Yeah, it's going to look something like this, right? When actually, you could probably improve by getting rid of these 0 EV hands. You could reduce your variance a little bit. And again, you could let the other players make those high variance plays. Or like we've seen some players doing already, make mistakes where their ranges are too wide and they're just giving EV away to the table. So hopefully you've got those screenshots and you're comparing those ranges in that situation. And the next one is the 10 big blind stack, the guy that shoved here. So here's what that range looks like. And again, pretty darn tight. The general theme so far seems to be pretty darn tight. So we already know from studying the last hand that we just did that ace jack isn't going to be a shove, right? Our position is one worse now. Stack size roughly the same. Same ICM pressure, so we actually notified that if we're only playing a push-fold strategy, the ace-jack is going to be put into the fold category. And I'll bring up, this is from the last hand, this isn't from this hand, but we can see it's basically break-even now. We make our position one worse and it's going to be negative. We're going to be playing very tight, probably this range right here. Not even king-queen suited, we'll play ace-queen, down to ace-queen suited, and then down to 10, something like that, if we're only jamming or folding. So, as we've seen in some situations, like when we were talking about the button, and then, looking in a limping strategy from the small blind, there are reasons to have a min open raise size at this stack size. And the main reason would be that players are playing too tight versus the min open. And so you're going to be expecting to generate more fold equity than you normally would versus a computer player where I think the computers are actually going to be calling versus the min raise quite a bit and trying to see flops, especially from these positions back here where they're getting a really good price. And also the table isn't going to be reshoving on you as often as they should be. Once that starts happening, once they're tighter in both not 3-betting as much as they should be and folding more than they should be, then we could start implementing a min-raising strategy. And what we would actually be doing, even at the stack size with the ace-jack from this position, we would probably be putting it in a min-raise and a fold. And because, again, we're expecting players to play too tight versus our min-raise. So that means that if ace-jack is a fold to begin with, if we're trying to take advantage of tightness, if we do min-raise it, we have to be willing to fold it. So hopefully we're min-raising and looking to fold here because we're min-raising trying to take advantage of the tightness of the table. Man, I would. I mean, seeing how the kind of recreational stuff that's going on with this player, I probably wouldn't be able to fold versus just him. But once this guy calls, although we are getting a better price and need less equity, you can see we only need 19% versus 23 versus just him. Versus their combined ranges, I just think Ace-Jack is going to be doing quite a bit worse, and I would actually just be willing to fold here, as we do see happening. So let's hope we can see showdown here. And this is the exact kind of thing, like, one of the problems with, I think a lot of people, like, so let's say this guy bet the 3 big blinds, he folds and it comes to us. I wouldn't want to jam because I don't think he's donking anything 3-handed that we're going to get to fold. And I think a lot of his range is going to be comprised of like 3s, 4s, 6s, 7s, and then maybe the random like Ace-2 suited or things like that. It's going to be comprised of a lot of stuff like this. If we're not generating any fold equity versus that, we don't want to be putting it in. But there are, if he folds and we call, we're getting a pretty good price where you saw we only need 23% equity. With our 6 outs, if we get to see it twice, we're at about 24% equity, 25% equity. And the nice thing is there are a lot of turns and rivers where I think this guy is going to be able to check. And we're going to, one, either be able to try to get to showdown, where he checks the turn and we can try to see the river for free. Or it could be a turn that's really good for us and he checks and we can actually develop some fold equity and put in the shove and maybe try to get those hands like the 4s and things to fold. So heads up, we can probably convince ourselves to call and see what develops, and probably try and bluff a king or a queen turn, and then look to get value out of an ace or a jack turn. Or if it goes check on the turn and it's like the 7 that we see here, we can check back and hope to see one of those overcard rivers where we can put the money in. And on this board, I would just be checking it down and expecting to lose a lot, just because, one, we expect his range to have those pairs, and we definitely don't expect him to fold them on this board. As we see here, he didn't fold them. So we lost a player, and hopefully we took some notes on this guy again. I think his play was maybe reasonable on the flop, just kind of protecting his equity a little bit. But I think once he gets called from this spot, I think his play he should have been able to fold. Okay, next hand. All right, we're getting jammed on here. And I think this is going to be a very wide jamming range by this player. And very tight ranges by both the players here. Especially, I think our range is actually going to be able to be probably similar to his, if not maybe slightly wider. Reason being is we're just getting a slightly better price. But at the same time, still has to be very, very tight because of the ICM pressure. So let's plug this one in, and hopefully you guys are plugging in your ranges to check what his shoving range should be, what his calling range should be, and also what our calling range should be. And we're going to check that one out. And I'm about to bring it over here in just a second, so hopefully you're ready to see that. So he should be able to shove 82% of hands. Very, very, very wide range from that spot. Oh, I just realized I'm a dork. We're not getting a better price because we have more chips to play for. So one, we're getting a worse price. I don't know why I said a better price there. I was thinking from the terms just because we're in the big blind. If stacks were the same, we would be getting a slightly better price. So we're getting a worse price, and we actually have more ICM to consider, so we're tighter. So a little bit of a brain fart on my part, a little bit of a slip there. But you can see he gets to shove very wide, and we just have to play pretty darn tight. Here's the range here. And again, if either of the blinds are playing tighter than the ICM, I think he's going to be tightening up quite a bit. And the first thing to do would be to tighten up all these really borderline ones. If people are calling a little bit too wide, and you can see there's a lot of those that are just barely plus EV. Here's what the small blind range looks like. So hopefully the ranges you guys put together look something similar to this. We get incredibly tight if the small blind calls. If the small blind folds, here's what our range looks like. So pretty similar, but definitely a little bit tighter. ICM and getting a worse price are big factors here. So hopefully your range looks something similar to this. The other thing I would consider is that there are going to be a lot of players out there that aren't going to take advantage of the ICM pressure and aren't going to get this wide. You know, let's not get crazy tight, but let's tighten it up a little bit here. 19, 16, and now we go to 14 and 11. So we do need to be aware of the players. If we think they're a very good, strong player and are going to be really trying to take advantage of that ICM pressure, then we need to make sure that we're defending appropriately. But as they tighten up, and you can see we didn't really, he's still shoving a pretty darn wide range here, right? We got to really be ready to tighten up our range really quickly. So that's definitely something to be aware of as well. And also we can see that the King 9 isn't even close versus either of the ranges. So very good fold here. I think hopefully there's none of you guys that would have made that call here. So one thing we've seen is that the really big chip leaders have been able to have either incredibly wide or close to 100 or even 100% shoving ranges here. I think with us in this spot, our range is going to be pretty wide, but not quite 100% because he's actually representing a stack that he has us covered here. Couldn't do the math in my head real quick. But yeah, he has us covered, so we're actually risking our tournament life, which means that it could be devastating the times that he does call. He can take us out. So we have to consider that, which means that we actually can't be as wide as if we had had him covered by a huge amount. So keep in mind that we've seen some of these situations over here where when there's a huge chip stack and the guy has 20 big blinds and there's that ICM pressure, they get to have 100% shoving range. Keep that in mind, but now think of how the situation's changed a little bit. And I would definitely build your range for our shoving range and then also what he should be calling with here. And here we go. So like I said, we can still go very, very wide here, but we're not at 100%. And obviously 9-2 is a definitely easy fold. And you can see a lot of these are pretty borderline. So if he's going to be calling wider than ICM again, you know, we can start getting rid of a bunch of this stuff. And if we do shove our 76, he's only supposed to be calling 25% of the time. And that's kind of what that range looks like. And actually, this is something that I would expect to be pretty close to the calling range of players based on my kind of limited tournament experience. This is kind of the ranges that I've seen. So we fold correctly, and he picks it up. All right, so we've already talked about some reasons for potentially wanting the limp here and where those come from. And so we've already talked about those reasons. Let's see if we can say showdown here and there's anything to talk about. And he puts out a one big blind, gets taken down, so that's really nice. You know, that's kind of a really good follow through on the limping strategy where if you expect his range to be capped getting to the flop, you're taking advantage of that capped range with a really small steal on the flop. Nice. Just going through real quick to see if we can see showdown. Nope. So again here, based on everything we've seen so far, we know that this 8-Jack is going to be a fold. We know, we see some shorter stacks here. There's some ICM pressure. We've known that we were going to be pretty tight in a lot of spots. I'm actually not going to run this one. I'll leave that for you guys to run. We're going to try to push through the rest of the video as quickly as we can because I think I've already brought up quite a few spots. And I'm going to try to focus on spots that are a little bit closer and more interesting. But again, if I were you guys, I would definitely take the time. If you're unsure about this, I would definitely take the time to go through all the steps that we did before and run this on your own. I think we're getting down to a stack size where we probably don't want to have a min opening range from under the gun. You could still make an argument for it, you know, from the later positions, but under the gun, our range just needs to be super tight to begin with. We've only got 11, almost 11 big blinds, you know, 10 and a half, or sorry, almost 12 big blinds. I think at this point, from these early positions, we just need to be very tight in developing a push or fold strategy. And if we want to mess around with min raising and stuff, save it for, you know, some of these later positions here and try to take advantage of the tight players left to act. But here, just by the number of players, there's so much room for things to be happening that it doesn't, I don't think it works out very well for us. We see a tiny 3-bet. I think we probably end up having to call here and are just looking for like an overcard with backdoors, or, you know, a gut shot, or I guess it's really hard to make a gut shot with this hand, but it could be like 5, 6, 9 or something like that. You know, or a pair or something and just get it in on the flop with our stack size. But the price here is just insanely good. If we are gonna limp, I think we have to take advantage of this just really, really good price. And realistically, you know, having 6.41 big blinds versus 9.4 big blinds, if we do end up having to check fold the flop, isn't going to really change our tournament situation all that often. But my main strategy here would just to be to fold the a7 from the end of the gun. So I wouldn't have put myself in this really awkward situation where we're getting an incredible price, and are just kind of in a gross spot. I would just be push folding here. And again, I'll leave you guys to run this hand, but we've already seen over and over just playing really tight from these positions. Next hand. We're getting shoved on, and this is going to be a fold. But let's look at these two ranges here now that stacks are actually getting pretty shallow, and we do have a, you know, really short stack to consider. I think this is kind of an interesting spot. All right, so hopefully you've got your ranges all plugged in. But he ends up being able to shove pretty darn wide here, 73% of hands. And because you actually get to leave yourself with a couple chips and you have him covered, you're actually getting to play wider than I think we've played in most of the spots when we're calling. You know, it's very important in tournament theory. I mean, if you can leave yourself with a chip or a couple extra chips behind and you still have a chance to maybe get that super hot run and double up a couple times, you know, being able to leave yourself with a couple chips is very important. And you can see just how much of a difference it makes with our range and how wide we're able to get. Obviously, like I said, 10-6 is just a very negative call, but I'm guessing this range is probably wider than most of us would be willing to call with. So hopefully something to take away from that. Okay, we already looked at that. Pretty easy fold here. Let's see if we see a showdown. I don't mind him having a calling range here and not just jamming. I actually think that I think his reshoving range here should actually be very tight because of the short stacks. But he can call very wide because he's getting a really, really good price. Block bet on the river, and he just folds, and yeah, okay. A reasonable hand. So it's definitely important in tournaments that you're paying attention to these spots, seeing if you can get to showdown, seeing if you can pick up any information, bet sizing differences and tells on board textures. Anything you can pick up is going to be valuable to you later on. So we're seeing the limp again here. We're seeing a 4x raise versus the 3 that he used earlier. Not sure why, but we do see a bigger sizing, so that might be something to look into. And then we see that, so twice he's limp jammed. The first time we saw 5s, we'd want to take a note of that. And then we've seen another limp jam, so we just want to make sure that we are noting that limp shoving at 25 big blinds or under effective, 25 big blind to 20, or I think he was 19 the first time, is a part of this guy's strategy, so we'd want to be aware of that. Let's look all the way through here, see if we... This guy's playing way too tight. He needs to call here. Oops. Okay, versus this min raise at this stack size, he needs to call here with any 2 cards. Not put it all in, just call here, and then obviously if he has like king queen or any of the real premium hands, he can just put it in because he's never folding on the flop. But you actually substantially increase your EV over folding with even a hand like 7-2 offsuit by calling here. And if you flop any kind of reasonable equity, like even if you flop just an overcard to the board, a gut shot, a backdoor straight, pair, anything that's decent, you're going to just be getting it in on most boards because you're going to have the equity to do so. But calling, and then it also allows you to fold on, all the just terrible non-connected boards, and you can get away with that. And so if you're curious about the math behind this and all the proofs that go into saying that that's definitely the case, that you can call here with any 2, go to Run It Once, check out Steve's Paul video series on playing short stacked in the big blind, and absorb that information there. But the work has been done by very good mathematicians and very strong poker players. That's definitely the case, especially when your stack sizes are really, really short. Because I mean, the difference between having a 2.5 big blind if you fold and 3.5 big blinds if you call and fold the flop, and 3.5 big blinds by just folding is, there's no difference in your tournament life. So I mean, if you guys wanted to plug in the ranges here, you could, and see if 6s falls into a call versus an under the gun 7 big blind range. My guess is it should, but if you're not unsure about that, then I would definitely plug it in and check it out. We're gonna, like I said, try to plug through a little bit quicker, just because this video is already getting really long. Similar to what I was talking about here, this definitely needs to be a call. At least, I think Queen Jack 2 broadways at our stack size is strong enough where we're probably not going to be folding on many flops, so we could even just get it in. But I guess because of ICM, because of how short this guy is, we would actually prefer to call and then look to have, like once we call, the pot's going to be 5.5 big blinds, and we're going to have 5 left. So when he puts us all in, we're going to be getting 2 to 1, which means that we only need 33% equity. And I mean, there's going to be a lot of boards where we're going to have 33% equity and get it in. Maybe because of ICM, we need a little bit more than 33, but it's still going to be pretty darn close. So I would end up calling here and seeing what develops on the flop. Let's actually check here and see if the ICM pressure is enough where it doesn't get in Queen Jack pre-flop at our stack size. I think given his position and the ICM, there's a good chance, and how tight we have seen us have to play before, I think there's a good chance that that's the case, but that we're not jamming. But I am curious here. Okay, so we did allow him to have a min-open strategy. One thing to note is that if he is doing only a min-open, even at his stack size, it's wanting him to be very tight. But you can see here that when it gets down to the later to the stages, people are playing a lot of hands. And again, we're probably expecting people to be folding more often than what we see here, which means that his range, if he is min opening, can actually be a little bit wider. But for now, let's just leave it like this. When it gets to us, our reshoving range is very tight here. And you can see that Queen Jack off is definitely not a part of it. But when we're looking at our calling range, again, I mean, we get to call very, very wide and should be calling with any two cards. And Queen Jack is certainly well within that. The only thing I wanted to see is if just because our stack size was so short, are we just going to be getting Queen Jack in? I mean, getting it in looks, oops, wrong. Jamming here actually seems to be reasonably plus CV with the Queen Jack off. 0.34, 0.26, but it looks like with a call, if we're playing really well on the flop, we can actually improve the EV. And that's why we end up calling with it. But even against a really tight range here of only 14% of hands, we can actually end up playing here. So I would have, like I said, I would have put in the call with the Queen Jack and just looked for some connectivity on the flop, and then you're going to end up having to get it in. And again, Steve Paul's videos on Run It Once, short stack play from the big blind or something like that series. Here, let's check this one and see what our strategy can look like. We're getting pretty short, but we still have a little bit of ICM looking at that guy, but at some point we just have to go with our hands. And let's see if this is the cutoff for 8-9. So again, billion range. I definitely think that we're not going to be shoving any two cards. I definitely do not think that's the case here. But we should be pretty wide here at our stack size, I think. So hopefully you guys got your ranges ready, because I'm bringing it over right now. And boom, you can see, I mean, we're supposed to be shoving 64.4%. So still having quite a bit of folds, but 8-9 off is actually falling within a hand range that's comfortable for me to get it in. And just trying to get that double up, or get the fold and get those chips. You know, there's some small percent of his range that will be folding. One thing here, I guess, let's look at this. Let's look at what his calling range should be. I mean, we're expecting to be called a lot here, right? And we're still end up shoving the 9-8. If he ends up folding hands like 10-3 suited, 10-4 suited, Queen 2 offsuit, Jack 5 offsuit, things like that, that's going to just increase our equity a little bit. So let's tighten them up just a tiny bit. Not really all that much tighter, but let's compare that now. You can see, I mean, just doing really good for us. So, and we haven't really seen this guy be too active throughout the final table. That's another good indicator that this is going to be doing at least as well for us as what we're seeing with the calculator. All right, here's our chance. Hopefully get that ladder. Boom. Nice. This is interesting here. First, I'm actually curious if we even get this in versus his open in this position. And now I'm curious if we are just gambling at 4 big blinds here and hoping for a nice little almost quad up with all the blinds and antes. So let's put this one in. To me, I'm guessing it's going to be a fold, but I'm kind of curious if what our range looks like here. All right, so I'm getting ready to pull it over. So hopefully you guys got all your ranges worked out that you're willing to look at. And first thing we are going to look at when he opens, when it gets to us, what our get it in range looks like. And you can see that we're actually playing pretty tight even on a really short stack. This is actually tighter than I imagined we would play. I kind of thought more of our King X suited would want to get it in, and some more of these hands. And to be honest, I was actually curious whether or not Jack 7 suited would get in with only 4 big blinds. Getting a really good price and having a okay-ish suited connector with 1 Broadway card. Turns out, not even close. Terrible. Terrible. And even Jack 10 suited. Like, Jack 10 suited, in my mind, was without question going to get it in. Here it looks like it's, Doesn't matter what you do, fold or call. You're not making any money with it doing either option. So that's a little bit surprising to me, 4 big blinds. And then obviously if that's the case, once this guy 3 bets and it gets to us, we're just playing incredibly tight. We could even consider folding, something like king, queen suited if we think that these guys are going to be tighter than what it's showing here. So there's that. Hopefully you guys got something out of that spot. And then the other thing we could, I guess we don't get to see their ranges here. But his range to shove, what I didn't put up here, his range to shove, if you guys did that one, ends up looking like this. Should be pretty darn tight. Okay. Next hand. Getting it all in here. I think we're short enough where his calling range should probably be any 2, in my opinion, but let's check and see if I'm right. I think a lot of people would probably agree with me and just call with any 2 cards, but it's always good to check those assumptions. Okay, so first thing, our shoving range. Obviously we expect king, queen off to be in there, no problem. It gets to the big blind, and he's actually making a pretty significant mistake, it looks like. Well, a mistake. With the 3-6, it's about a break-even call, so it doesn't matter one way or the other, but this is actually, according to the program here, a slight mistake. So we might want to put on him that, when stacks get really short and he has a chip leader, he's going to call a little bit wider than recommended. That might be something to note for us, so that we would make sure that we're tightening up a little bit of this. We get the double up, nice. Another one worth checking. So keep in mind, we're not actually under the gun here because 2 people have been knocked out. So our position is bumped up a little bit. Obviously under the gun +1. This is going to be a fold, as the tournament conditions were before. But a couple things have changed. One, we're now the shortest stack, so the ICM pressure on us is reduced a decent amount. And a couple people have been knocked out, so we're now more moved into the mid position spot. I still think queen 9 is going to be a little bit too loose, but I do want to check and see if I'm right or wrong. And hopefully you guys, rather than just checking the specific hand, hopefully you're still doing your ranges, all that range work like I was doing before. And here comes the chart. So yeah, my feeling was pretty dead on here in this case that queen 9 was actually really close in this spot. But definitely on the fold side, so a good fold. And actually we could, if we're gonna stick to some of the stuff I've been saying earlier, we could even consider folding some of these guys, and even some of these hands as strong as like the ace-9 suited, tightening up just a tiny bit. All right. Definite call here. Yeah. So we're missing some of these spots here. This is just a spot where a suited king is actually going to be pretty powerful for our stack size. And we're getting a really good price here, only needing 11% equity. And the nice thing about this is, although we have poor position, absolute position, we do have good relative position in that we get to see what the preflop raiser does, and then these guys have to make a decision, and then we get to see what happens. So we're going to get a lot of information by the time it comes back to us when we're actually making our real decision, because we're probably just going to be checking the flop always, get to see all this information, and then get to make a decision. So that's actually pretty powerful for us, especially when our decision is probably going to be get an in or fold on the flop. So I think definitely missing some opportunities there when we're getting those really good prices. So here, from everything we've seen before, my guess is that this is going to be a fold. And even something like ace-9 suited, or 8-9 suited might be a fold as well. And when you can see everybody folding, then we're definitely liking his min raise rather than just jamming and trying to take advantage of all the short stacks. But the other thing, when I was saying fold, sorry, I meant not shoving, but also when he's min opening, we do get the option to call here, and we've seen before that calling with pretty wide ranges is actually going to be pretty nice for us. So let's run through this hand real quick again. And for if I were you, I would run your shove range and your call range, and then also do a shove range and a call range for this player. And hopefully you guys have got those worked out. In just a second, we're going to be ringing over the results. Okay, so the first thing to look at is if he's limping, he should actually only, or min raising there, 2.1, he should actually be going a pretty tight range. But the reason being is we're seeing him, again, the big blind's playing 100% of cards from that spot. In the small blind, we're playing 50% of our cards from that spot. And, you know, so, I mean, with the big blind and the small blind, he's not really generating any fold equity, which means that he actually has to have some okay equity to be opening with. When that's not going to be the case, when people are going to be folding quite a bit more than that, our min raise strategy gets to allow us to play a lot wider range, which is why sometimes that min raise strategy can be really powerful. So here for us, as far as our calling range, we can see that 9-7 suited, 9-8 suited, all those things are planted firmly in there. Not even trying to mix it up with 3-betting those. You know, playing a pretty wide calling range, but still doing a lot of folding. And then, you know, with our value, just getting ready to put it in right away. And then here from the big blind, really calling a ton. And getting a little bit wider here with some of this stuff out here, but mostly focusing on the value. Yeah, a lot of calling going on. That's one of the big takeaways from the big blind with these really small opens at really short stacks. It's pretty beneficial. So we could have definitely called here. And obviously folding here. Nice shove. So I'm gonna not, again, said it a couple times, but not running through all the situations. But hopefully you guys are, you know, if you're doing this on your own, hopefully you're taking the time to actually run through all these situations and study these spots. I believe the sixes here are going to be really close for us. And one that I will let you guys run on your own. And I would definitely make a note of that. I think a lot of people just assume that when really short stacks like this are min raising, that they have aces or kings or some incredibly strong hand. And this is really good that we get to see a showdown here that he shows up with king jack. I think probably his stack size a hand that was probably going to min raise call. But, you know, you can make that note min raised, king jack off, early position, or mid position, I guess now. On a 10 big blind stack. That's a good note to have. So that you know that his range isn't only aces when he's doing that. And even if you have stats on the player that shows that he's a really tight player, you now have that note as well. And that's really an important thing to be able to look at. So here we're definitely going to be calling with a 9-7. Yeah, we talked about this a bunch already. And this is even better because we get to play in position. So having the ability to check back on some streets when he ever checks to us and just realize equity for free makes our calls even more profitable. And we're getting a really good price to begin with. So we saw here, this is the one that we had before when it was a cutoff mid-open. And we can see that 6-4 was borderline, which means that now when it's the under the gun opener, I'm definitely fine with just folding this here. If we were in the big blind, we would certainly be calling this. But yeah, that's fine there. And again, you can see rather than having to run that spot, I already have a spot pulled up that was really similar that I could reference and, you know, make some good assumptions from. it won't be perfect, but we can still learn something from that other situation about and apply it to a slightly different one. Jamming the ace-3 here. Versus the queen-4. So I think we want to look at his calling range and see whether that's correct or not. We've already seen once before that he calls a little bit wider versus short stack shoves than he should. So that's a note that we should have at this point. Hopefully you guys are building your shoving range and your calling range here. Coming on over. And we can see that, you know, all of our ace-x are well within the shoving range. I actually kind of expected at the stack size that all of the king-x would be as well, so this is a little bit surprising to me that, you know, we're probably only going down to like king-8 or king-9, and even folding, you know, maybe even considering folding some of the king-x suiteds. That's actually surprising me. I thought we are the shortest stack. So without the ICM pressure and being so short, I really thought we were going to value king-high and ace-high quite a bit. Not the case here. When it gets to him to call, you know, he should only be calling 37.7%. And you can see here that those queen X offsuits are definitely not a part of that range. And yeah, he's definitely calling too wide. And one thing, so if I was him, I would have noticed that you've folded quite a bit of your big blinds to the min raises, which would tell me that you're very likely tighter than you should be in a lot of spots, which means that when I get shoved on here and I'm him, I would also expect your shoving range to not be like 100% or 80%. I would probably expect you to have a slightly tighter shoving range than even maybe what the charts would show, which would mean that I would actually want to tighten up a little bit. So he's actually going way in the opposite direction of what someone who's kind of really paying attention to how this tournament is playing out should be doing. So there's that takeaway there. So I would definitely, you know, make sure we have some of that notes on that situation. And easy fold here. Ooh, that looks pretty. 12 big blinds, probably just open shoving from the under the gun. Kind of talked about that a little bit, where from this spot, I'm really not too interested, especially when we're under 15 big blinds and having a min raise strategy. Beautiful flop. So since we did do the min raise, on this kind of a board texture, I would be fine, especially at our stack size, just like a quarter pot c-bet. If you're min raising this, I mean, if you are having a min raise strategy, that means that you're going to have some non-ace highs and actually have some hands that want to c-bet bluff here, or even some weaker pocket pairs that want to protect your equity and things like that, and yeah, just protect your equity on this board. So I think just doing like a quarter pot c-bet with your entire range is going to be a good way to go. This is definitely too big here. I think you're a little bit too worried maybe about the fact that there's a flush draw on the board, but I mean, even with a quarter pot bet, you're easily setting up for stacks over 3 streets, and it just gives you a really good price to put out a c-bet on a board that's good for you with your entire range. So I would just go really small here. I mean, if you guys were really, really deep, then you can make an argument for betting bigger there, but I like a smaller c-bet for sure. Okay. Yeah. So remembering some of the hands before, I think 6-8 off is not going to be a call, and it also his sizings get a little bit bigger. So yeah, pretty easy fold here, and definitely not reshoving that one. That seems reasonable to me. Rough. That's funny. So we could, if you guys want to do this on your own, put in your shove range here, put in your shove range here, and then put in your calling range here for either of these positions, just to keep studying that. Again, we expect this guy to be wider than he should. King 9, I think our stack size is going to be well within a range. He shows up with kings and just destroys him. And we get another ladder. Ace-3 is just going to be a fold here. I really think that this player should be betting a lot at this point. He actually wants to turn his things like King-Queen, Queen-Jack suited, you know, those things that didn't 3-bet Jack-10s into a bluff. He wants to protect his hands like pocket sixes. I guess maybe if he didn't 3-bet something like Ace-Jack or something pre-flop, maybe he could try to check it down. But I think once it gets checked back on this board, I don't know. This isn't really a great board for the small blind calling range, but I don't think a lot of players recognize that. And once they check back here, are probably just way too capped, and we kind of want to take advantage of that. Yeah, that would have been about the only hand that I would have been trying to check down here. Oh, we don't get to see his for some reason. But I think we would have been very willing to 3-bet this hand to begin with. All in with 7 seems good. Scooping it up. This is interesting that he's checking back this here. I just feel like this is a really good board for the opener. One that he could probably get away with c-betting his whole range for, you know, the third pot or a quarter pot. So that's kind of interesting, especially with a guy that's been calling too wide. I kind of would expect him to be a little bit more of the type that's also more aggressive on the flop. Let's see what we see on the turn. It goes check again. We see kind of a big bet, so maybe going for a check back delayed c-bet with like some Jack X or some total air hands. And interesting solo play on the flop. Yeah, I think he definitely should have been betting this on the flop for value. I don't know. We haven't, this whole tournament, this whole final table, we haven't really seen a ton of post-flop action. You know, a lot of it that's gotten to the flop has been c-bet fold. So there's not really any reason to assume that by checking back we're inducing a lot of bluffs from this guy. But there's still a lot, you know, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of air in his range here. Or maybe even not that much since he's the small blind. Yeah, he's a small blind. So with him being the small blind here, there's actually not a ton of total whiffs. He's usually going to have at least like a gut shot. But he's also going to have a ton of pairs here. And I think we want to just start getting value right away. And yeah, if he does have air, we don't have any real indication that this guy's just going to start bluffing all of a sudden when we check back, which is really what we need when we want to slow play. We want him to know that our check back is inducing a higher bluff frequency than should actually be there. So I would have just stuck with a bet on the flop and then bet the turn, and then, you know, probably check back this river. Mistakes were made. Definitely going to be calling here with the ace of spades, getting a really good price, and also having some backdoor straights. So we do call, good. Once it goes check, check, I think this 10, I think the 9 and us having the 10 blocker, trying to spend a second here. It's really hard for us to rep a jack because I think people would expect for us at this stack size, if we had a jack, to just check raise, especially on a reasonably connected board. So we can't rep a jack, but we can still rep things like 8-9. We can still rep things like Queen 10, 7-10. I don't really like turning this hand into a bluff for a small bet because it actually has a lot of showdown value. And I think a small bet can actually, like, let's say we bet a third pot blocking bet. I think it's relatively easy for him to just find a hero call with, you know, some weaker ace highs or some stronger ace highs. And certainly if he has like pocket 7s or pocket 10s or, you know, check back some like king 8s and things like that, find the calls there. So I don't like turning a hand that actually has some showdown value into a bluff for the really small bet, but I'm trying. So if I do turn it into a bluff, I think I just want to shove here. But at the same time, I'm trying to think if we can rep enough really strong hands that makes it worth it, or if his range is just so capped in general that it doesn't matter. But it's tough because again, we have showdown value, and when you're bluffing, you have to consider that sometimes turning a hand that has showdown value into a bluff actually, even though you do get some folds, actually reduces the EV because you still have EV in the check line. Let's actually spend a second. This hand just got kind of interesting on the river. We're gonna pull up card winner's EV and actually kind of check it rather than me just throwing out some assumptions. I'm actually going to put them on into the program, check them, and actually come to make some conclusions here. So for you it'll be no time, but for me it'll probably be like a half an hour. I'm gonna get to work in this program, put a bunch of stuff in, and then we'll come back and check out the results. Okay, I'm finally back here, and I've managed to build this tree with some assumptions, and we're going to play around with this a little bit and see if we can't come to a really good decision about what to do with our ace-10 here. So I'll show you what I did here. I did my best guess to come up with a range that he's going to get to the river with. Basically, all these tags up here are hearts and diamonds. So because there was a spade draw on the flop and then a club draw on the river, I said if he had any of the backdoor flush draws or open-ended straight flush draws, he was going to be just probably getting them in on the turn, given the stack sizes. And so this is only the 8-7 of diamonds. So there's that. Then we have all these ace-king and king-queen combos, and then some ace-10s. Basically what I'm saying, he's never checking a jack on the turn, and he's probably not slow playing these hands, but I did give him the ability to make up for maybe the times that he slow played pocket aces or something like that. We do have him slow playing pocket jacks and pocket eights on the turn. 10s and 9s, I had him checking 50% of the time here, just because some players will still bet those pairs on the turn, given that they're only beat by one overcard, and like I said, they might expect us to check raise a lot of the jack X on the flop to begin with. So not quite sure. Some players check, some players still bet. So I left those in there. And then the pairs below the 8, I allowed those to be in the range as well. I didn't get too wide with a bunch of these because he was in mid position here. We still have the cutoff and the button to go through. And we haven't really seen a lot of activity pre-flop from people, so I kind of expected to be pretty tight. So yeah, that's why we didn't go too crazy. And also why we don't have all the pocket pairs in here, but we could actually even... Let's actually put those in here some of the time. Something like that. And actually I'm going to say no pocket 2s. Probably pocket 2s is slow played very, very seldomly, so. And actually probably no pocket 4s. So we're in the pocket 3s. Anyway, so this is kind of the range that I put together. Without having a ton of information on the player, I think this is somewhat close, but could potentially be just slightly wider with a little bit more air combinations. And then we just have our ace-10 off here. So it's actually going to be a little bit important, the more that I think about it, to have our specific combo, because that's going to affect those check-back combos of the ace-x when we have the spade. So it'll make it a little bit more likely that he actually has ace-x when we have this specific combo. So the first thing that we want to do is we always want to have our baseline EV. What happens when we check the river and let's say he just checks back his entire range? And you can see here we have an EV of 2.49 and he has an EV of 6.25. So this is the most ideal situation, or at least we want to make sure that we can beat this scenario if this is kind of what we expect. What I said here, though, is that when we check, he does probably have some quality of hands that are going to bluff some of the time. And I said that was his King-X combos. Probably going to do a lot of checking back with his Ace-X, not really turn those into a bluff. And because he's betting with, if he's betting any hands that are better than ours, we don't really care because we're not calling. So I only put his bluffs here in the bet. And you can see if he's always bluffing 100% of the time, we still have a little bit of EV on the check line, even though we're folding to his bluffs all the time. So, I mean, this is the absolute worst case scenario for us when we check, and we're still having plus EV, so we absolutely have to make sure we're beating this. But I'm going to say that he's not going to be betting 100% of the time. Let's go something a little bit more reasonable. You know, put it at like a number that's still pretty high, so a little bit pessimistic, but probably closer to the truth. And let's make this our target. We want to beat 1.37 with either the block bet line or the overbet shove line, because I think these are our two options here. So the next thing, let's go to the block bet line. And the way that I'm going to do this is I'm always going to start out with the most pessimistic assumptions. And what I said was when we block bet, he's calling with, basically, to start with, he's calling with all of his pairs, and he's actually calling with ace king, ace queen, and ace 10. And he's folding all of the weaker ace x. So basically, all we're ensuring is that when we block bet is he doesn't get to bluff us this 75% of the time. That's really all that's happening. And now you can see we're down to 0.95. So definitely a decrease if this is the case where he's able to make all of these calls. And I think one thing that we'll see is pairs probably happen quite a bit. So I'm not going to reduce this frequency, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the ace king, ace queen, and we're going to make that a variable here. What we're going to do here is say this one. So what we're doing is if he's calling with this 100% of the time, we know it's bad for us. So we need him to fold this. So let's go from 0 to 90. So already if he's folding his ace highs 10% of the time, we're at 1.24, which is really close to our checking and letting him bluff line in the pessimistic route. And then you can see if he's folding 15%, this number is how often he's calling, right? So if he's folding 15% of the time, we're starting to beat that. 80% of the time, we're really starting to do good. So actually starting to look at the block bet, you know, I think numbers in this range here for folding, like the ace king, and even if he's calling with all of his one pair hands after checking back the turn, I actually think this is pretty reasonable. And the reason I don't have him reshoving, because if he does reshove, we're going to be folding, and I just don't expect all that many bluffs to be put in this line versus the block bet. You know, maybe there's a really small frequency, but I think mainly it's just going to be a slow plays or the rivered like 8-9 two pair or something like that. So yeah, I would actually say that expecting, you know, something like this would be pretty reasonable. So we'd already shown that the block bet, let's just put this in here at 80, 1.53, go back to just double check, 1.37. So we've already improved by block betting versus checking. Again, I set this at a pretty pessimistic number. You guys will have to know, you know, like the opponents that you're playing against. We showed that if he's always just checking back and never bluffing, then it's above 2. So let's actually go back in here and see when we have to beat the two. So he needs to be folding his ace highs about 45% of the time, or sorry, 55% of the time, which is probably starting to get us in a pretty optimistic to beating when he's never bluffing. But against maybe some really straightforward and you know, non-hero collie type players, we can be getting into this. So there are some player profiles where we're just really doing really well by blocking and by trying to target specifically ace king and ace queen, and by preventing him from being able to bluff us with those king highs. You can see that actually the block bet starts to generate a lot of EV for us, you know, against those really straightforward and kind of nitty players, I guess we can say. And there's that one. So now let's move this up here. So now we're overbetting, and for right now I have him calling with all the pocket eights or pair of eights or better, all of his pairs and everything. We can see that this is obviously going to be a terrible situation for us. you know, he's we're just destroying money. So now let's say he folds all of the ace kings. And even if he folds all of the ace kings, we're still doing pretty bad. Let's say he folds all the one pairs as well and is calling with 8 or better. At that point, we're starting to print money. So let's put the variable here and leave the other one at 1. Oops, we changed this to variable 1. Sorry, we didn't make this 2. So again, this is keeping in mind that versus our jam, he's never calling with ace king, so he's never calling with his ace highs. And now he's starting to fold the pairs below the 8. And in order to get it into a realm where we feel really good, that has to be happening. If he's calling 65% of the time or more with those pairs, or less, then we're actually starting to do pretty good. If we want to be like the most amazing ideal situations, he needs to fold those 55% of the time or more, and then we're really starting to do good. And the reason I like to do the numbers is because, you know, you have to know your opponent. I could definitely tell you that on this board, there are some players that get pretty curious as to why you're overbetting and end up making the hero calls to the ace kings, because they would, you know, their line of thinking is you probably would have got it in with most of your jack X on the flop, you would have got it in with most of your 8X on the flop, and they probably don't expect you to value jam a 9. So, you know, those type of players get very sticky against you sometimes, and those guys are out there. But then there's also guys that just look down at a hand that doesn't pair the board, or look down at a hand that can't beat even the third pair on the board and just decide to fold. And it's really up to you to know your opponent and use your stats and use your best judgment on the players in your player pool to figure out, you know, which is going to be best based on all those drafts that we've shown so far. I would say here that I was actually surprised with how well the block bet performed. I kind of actually expected this to be one of the worst performing bets, but you can see that when you're giving yourselves a really good price and you expect people to kind of play pretty straightforward versus that, it actually does quite well for us. And it doesn't take a lot of better hands folding to make it actually become the best line. So I'm pretty liking the block bet. And then I guess against players that are going to be really, really call happy, I would just go for the check fold, would be my second best. And against players who are really tight and are just going to look down and start folding a bunch of stuff, then we could probably do really well with putting in the overbet fold and actually expecting to get all of those, you know, pocket sixes, pocket fives, and all of the ace kings, ace queens to fold. And that's kind of how I look at that versus those 3 breakdowns. So anyways, that's another way that I look at reviewing hands, is, you know, going through all the different options and using my assumptions on the player and the player pool and trying to come up with a good strategy for those situations. So that was that. Hopefully there was some good takeaways there. So we're jamming the ace 3 here, and our stack size is definitely going to be a jam. Boo. So he somehow gets there with the king 6. And again, I'm guessing that this actually isn't going to be a call until we start jamming like 100% of our hands, but we've already shown that we're not jamming 100%. Since this is the last hand for the tournament, we will run this hand. Again, if you want to put your shoving range here and the calling range here, I would definitely recommend doing that, but we're going to bring over the numbers right now. And boom, we can see that we're only supposed to be jamming 55.6% of hands, and a lot of them are really close, so we'll probably be tighter than that, especially against this guy. And we can see that king 6 is definitely negative, so he's tossing away some money from us, but I'll give you one more second to look at these in case you've done it, in case you've ran the numbers. So here's that one. And now what I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to give him all the king X. We saw the wide jack 9 call there. So we're going to give him something like this. Rerun it. And you went from 55% down to 30 4.5%. And then just look at how negative you're forcing all these calls to be. So it really allows you to make some money long-term versus a player like that that's calling too wide by just tightening up your range a little bit. And that will be it. So thank you guys very much for watching the video. Hopefully you made it all the way through, and hopefully you did a lot of studying for all those situations, and even some of the situations that I didn't cover. Hopefully you're doing some of those on your own. But I definitely recommend for you guys, like I said at the beginning of the video, do this for every time you make a final table, go through this, and the more thorough you are with your process, and the better you are at recording what you learned and putting that in a space where it's easy for you to review and pull up at any time, long-term benefits are going to be really nice for you guys. So do that, please, if you want to be one of the guys out there just crushing down the road, and you'll see it pay off for you. So anyways, like I said, again, thank you very much for watching. Good luck at the tables, and hopefully we'll see you guys in a video again soon. Take it easy, guys.